This is a Film Stories original podcast.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I am absolutely delighted to be talking to two editors, Andrew Netty and Sam Dagan, who are the editors of a wonderful book, a compilation of essays called Revolution in 35mm, Political Violence and Resistance in Cinema from the Arthouse to the Grindhouse, 1960 to 1990. And this book has been called a fantastic collection of essays, as vital and compelling as the films they analyse. The authors engage in the cinema of the time, mindful of the context, but also underline the relevance of the work today. Highly recommended. And that comment comes from no less an expert than, oh, that's embarrassing, John Bleasdale, host of Writers on Film podcast. I'm so embarrassed. I didn't realize that was going to happen. But it's a delight to have you on, Sam and Andrew. And this is also going to be one of the most ambitious writers on films because it's the biggest span of geography that we have. We have, Andrew, you're in Melbourne, Australia, I believe.
Correct.
And Sam, you're in New York.
I sure am.
So first question is, how did you guys connect in order to collaborate on this project?
How did we? I think we met through Facebook maybe years ago.
Years ago. I just in the ether of cinema criticism, cinema discussion on social media, I think, so people always bag out social media, and for good reason, but there are some good things too.
Sure. And I think, didn't you also come to Philadelphia for NoirCon at some point?
I did. I came to Philadelphia for NoirCon, which for people who may not be aware is this kind of wonderfully weird weekend of discussion on noir, television, film, books inspired by Philadelphian author David Goodis. Yes, and I came over to Philadelphia and I met you, and we hung out a bit.
Yeah, so we're also in-person friends, even though I have yet to go to Australia.
That's right. And we just basically came up. I mean, you had been talking about, Sam. You had been talking about this idea you had for a book that was kind of similar to what Revolution in 35mm would turn out to be. And I had done 3 books with a US publisher called PM Press, and I thought, actually, this sounds like, and those books were sort of on the history of pulp and paperback fiction in the sort of mid-20th century. And I was kind of keen to switch my wheelhouse a bit to film, and I thought this was a good idea that PM would go for. So it sort of went from there.
It's also interesting because I got to know Andrew, I think, through social media, or that's how we first interacted. And I remember seeing all these noir pictures of sort of secondhand books coming up and things like that. And those two, it's a really interesting crossroads, that sort of noirish literary angle, but also the sort of grindhouse cinema, cultish cinema sort of feel. It seems to be, there's some Venn diagram somewhere which is just a circle which encompasses those two things.
Well, there's also, I think, and this book, Revolution 35mm, talks about this too, perhaps more so than now, although I don't know if that's completely accurate. There was a much more of a blurring of those high and low cultures in that 60s, 70s, 80s period to some degree than there maybe is now. Hard to sort of always desegregate, and you see that in pulp fiction, of course, as well too. You see, major high modernist literary authors who in that period after World War II, their books got an incredibly sort of pulpy, highly sexualized sort of presentation. And you can sort of a similar dynamic in some respects is at play in certain aspects of cinema. I think, Sam, don't you agree?
Oh, totally. I mean, one of the essays that I probably had the most fun writing what is all about Japanese cinema in the 60s and 70s. And I think a lot of people who are familiar with the Japanese art house know that a lot of those films are political, like films by Oshima and Imamura and people like that. But I think what a lot of people don't realize is that the same themes around politics and leftism and political violence show up in a lot of like hardcore sex films, or not hardcore sex films, but the pink films that kind of approach hardcore, the much more transgressive ones, as well as the exploitation movies. And to see that kind of through line in so many titles, just, I think you're right. I don't think there is anything like that now where there's such a clear parallel.
Why do you think that is? Is it just the emergent property of a culture which is undergoing radical change, or is it something to do with the ideologies that are alive at the period that we kind of no longer have today, or at least aren't as articulated as they were? I mean, nobody today sort of openly says this is my named ideology to the same extent that they did back in the 60s, 70s, and even 80s.
Yeah, it's kind of heartbreaking. I mean, I think we don't really, on one hand, we don't really have exploitation cinema the way that we used to. And I think there are some film industry related reasons for that. And I think you also don't have, especially after, I'm not sure if you could set a hard year to it, but I think starting around the late 80s and going throughout the 90s, I think you have that real death of people coming out and publicly saying that they're communists or socialists or that they're, political radicals. And like, certainly there are people who still do that, but I think where artists and filmmakers are concerned, it seems like it kind of died out for some reason.
I think the other aspect too, I mean, I think that's totally correct, but I also think that what you see in that period, in that period leading up to World War II, and in the sort of, to some degree, the period after, and it varies between different countries, censorship is really strong. And that as that starts to break down it's always a blurred thing, but as that starts to break down in the 1960s, violence and, Pulp Fiction, for example, which has got a monopoly on sex and violence and to some degree, as a public sort of expression, it loses that to mainstream culture and everything becomes highly sexualized and violence comes into culture. And I mean, the mainstream culture, I think, much more than arguably it maybe was. I don't know. I mean, but you see but by the 1970s, everything is sexualized. All aspects of culture pretty much are sexualized, and that's something you sort of see in cinema. That doesn't really touch on the political aspect, I suppose, but it does touch on a lot of the films that are in our book.
Well, and I think some of that also, when you have sexuality and eroticism being so prevalent in late 80s, 90s, 2000s cinema, I think when they do start to show up, it makes it feel less transgressive because you could see it everywhere. And now I think we're kind of seeing the opposite of that, where at least in the US, like there are huge issues of censorship here that I'm sure a lot of Americans would disagree with. But the issues of censorship are largely financial. You can't really make a pro-communist Hollywood film. It would never get funded. It would never get distribution. It would never get positively reviewed. People would not go see it. And so I think having that explosion of sexuality and violence in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, now there's especially a pushback around sexuality. So it's like the films here are
definitely
very kind of flat and disappointing.
And politics too. I mean, even a very relatively mild statement like the one that Jonathan Glazer made at the last Oscars, the absolute, the global backlash that engenders was incredible. I mean, actually, in some respects, it's not incredible because it's a consciously manufactured outrage against his comments around Palestine. But I mean, it's certainly a signal to anyone that wants to make overtly political sort of films that are more overtly political than just talking about identity, which of course is prevalent in so much cinema now.
I mean, now that's all it is. It's like identity
Yeah,
politics
absolutely.
and all sorts of things around trauma, which not that there isn't a place for those type of films, and I do think they're important, but again, it's the issue of oversaturation when it's like every film is about identity politics or every film attempting to do something more than just escapism is concerned with those things. It's like, okay, but what about all these other political issues? Like, especially here, I think we have a real problem with there being a very limited left, certainly not a left that has any kind of media voice or public voice. And, that goes back to what you were talking about with World War II. It's been, I think the campaign against communism and leftism starting around World War II, if not even before, has been really effective in a bad way.
Let's get into the book because I feel this is a great conversation to have. But in a sense, your book is an argument against this conversation, or it's an argument that inspires me to feel, where are these bloody films today? Just because there is so much here that you are examining. There's such a wealth of cinema that you're examining. It feels like it's it would be a pity not to devote our time to this. But we can also come back to today as well, whenever you feel like it. I mean, I loved the way you structured the book as well, in terms of you had long chapters, essays by different people. And I also noticed a lot of your contributors were often people who had written novels as well, so there was this sort of creative element that went into their work. And then you had these short essays, which you called outtakes, which are you can almost dip into and out of, and sort of use the book almost like a cult cinema encyclopedia, where you would be able to hop around it. Let's start a little bit with Pontecorvo, because he's at the very beginning of the book, and he's one of these figures that I think people are familiar with from Battle of Algiers. But there's one film that I've never seen, which is Capote, which is remarkable when you talk about it, because this is a film which puts onto the screen concentration camps. I think it's one of the earliest depictions in the cinema of concentration camps, in fiction, at least.
Well, it's also one of the earliest films to have concentration camps and characters who are overtly Jewish.
Right.
Overtly Jewish and overtly political.
Yeah.
Right.
Because the film is essentially about, I mean, Pontecorvo's, Sam and I, when we, just to go back a bit, Sam and I, when we talked about, when we were sort of structuring the book and sort of nutting out who was going to be involved, who we wanted to cover and who we needed to cover. And of course, Giulio Pontecorvo was one of the directors we had to cover. He was crucial, and he's particularly crucial because he did 5 films, and 4 of those films are direct sort of discussions about political violence. What is political violence? What is the role of political violence? When is it justified? When is it not justified? How do you structure it? I mean, what are its impacts? And Capo is the first of those 4 films. The other ones are Battle of Algiers in '66, Burn in 1969, and my favourite of his films, Ogro, in 1979. And that film and Capo is fascinating because not only is it a very faithful and sort of authentic take on what's going on in a Nazi concentration camp, as you say, in 1960, incredibly early. It's also talking about how do you maintain a radical politics in the absolute nightmarish, surreal hell that is, a death camp. I mean, it's basically about a young Jewish girl whose family are taken by the Nazis. She ends up in a concentration camp. There's a communist doctor in the concentration camp that switches her identity for a dead Jewish young woman who's a criminal. And so this young woman takes on the criminal's identity and becomes a capo, becomes sort of one of the Jews that works for the Nazis as a security guard. And so it's about her and what she does to stay alive in that camp. And then, of course, she has a sort of a rethinking of her politics. But at the same time, there's a group of inmates in the camp, and Pontecorvo shows these people in the film who are political prisoners, and you see them trying to maintain their politics in the camp, sort of political discussions, small acts of sabotage for which, of course, if they're caught, they're instantly executed. And I mean, it's very much about all of those themes in the film, which of course then Pontecorvo would go on to explore in those other three films that I mentioned.
It's also wild to me that I think, to your point about how Capo is early, you have a couple of films coming out in the 50s that show concentration camps, but they never are as explicit. They never look at the group politics and group dynamics between the prisoners in the concentration camp. It's sort of everyone is this like painted as an innocent victim and doesn't really have a dynamic personality. And you also see some of the early films, like even something like Night and Fog, it really downplays the fact that the main goal of the Holocaust is the extermination of Europe's Jews. And so having this film come out in 1960 before the Adolf Eichmann trials really get going and before Hannah Arendt writes about them, people were so mad at him and hated this film and basically talked about like sort of how dare you, this is an exploitation movie. And I think it's interesting to think about films like this that were not popular because people thought they went too far. And I think there are a lot of films in the book that have a similar like mainstream critical reaction. Like either just trying to downplay their effectiveness and write them off as, exploitation movies, or just ignore them because they're too politically radical.
Pontecorvo is a great place to start because I think he's someone who's obviously political and he's obviously aiming to make political films. But then a lot of the book, you're looking at filmmakers who are making films in which the politics is much more under the radar, or is a much, they're making genre films like westerns or polizeschi, and police procedural films, Italian police procedural films, and they're or you use the example of bank heist movies in West Germany as well, where you kind of have to read into them to get that political angle. You could just walk in thinking, oh, I just want to see a crime movie, I just want to see a western. Whereas Pontecorvo's films, you're going to go and see a film called The Battle of Algiers. You're expecting to see a political film to some degree.
Yeah, but I think even with some of those, like the West German crime films, the spaghetti westerns, even something like later on in the book, Annie Rose Mallarmé covers like rape revenge films. I think you could certainly watch them, know nothing about the politics, and just walk away being entertained. But I think a lot of audiences who would have been watching them in the time period and countries where they were released probably would have picked up on those themes more. Because like in those West German films, a lot of them will make dialogue references to things happening in the news connected with terrorism and stuff like that. And so I think that was something that we really wanted to include in the book, was not just these more overtly kind of art house political films, but ways in which directors working in other types of cinema also addressed politics.
But it's also they're of their time. I mean, they're steeped. I mean, we just had we started the episode with that conversation about why why people aren't necessarily making overtly political films now. I mean, that's the thing. We go and see a film; it's marketed as, oh, this is an overtly political film. But these films were just imbibing from that whole atmosphere of the 1960s and the 1970s and even the early 1980s. You know, Vietnam with urban guerrilla struggles in various Western European countries, political terrorism, all those sort of things, and they're not. They're just sort of part of the fabric of the films. I mean, in a sense, we watch those films now and we go, oh, that's a really interesting sort of, those Italian polizioteschi films we talked about. I mean, the chapter in the book about conspiracy polizioteschi, about, and police who are unmasking right-wing conspiracies in Italian society. That was just in the ether of Italian society, wasn't it? I mean, it didn't need to make it an overt thing. I mean, an audience didn't need to be primed. You're going to go and see a film about that. It would just be in there, and they would just basically be able to recognise the politics and the signifiers and the codes that were sort of going on in those films.
Yeah, I was just watching. We were C'eravamo tante amati. We were very loved. We were once very loved. I think it is the Ettore Scola film with Vittorio Gassman, and there's a scene in it where they're watching. It's a period film, and they're partisans who are it follows their sort of post-war lives, and they're watching the bicycle thieves, and in a cine forum, and the sort of dignitaries get up and say this is a sort of rubbish that they're showing to show Italy in a bad light, and the young radical is sort of shouting them down and going, this is a work of art, and he loses his job because he's having an argument. And that sort of, in Italy you would have a cineforum, which would be usually a weekday showing, usually in a school hall or some public hall, community center, not necessarily in a cinema. And it would be a debate. It wouldn't be you're just watching a movie and leaving. It would also be sort of a part of, and this was, absolutely exists even to this day. This my local cinema does these all the time. So that sort of culture of debate and engaging in society as well as being a movie is very much alive and kicking, at least here.
That's incredible. If we tried to do that here, people would be shooting each other. Like absolutely shooting each other.
One of the things that you try to do in the book, and you succeed to do in the book, is you give the very broad spectrum as well geographically. I think you're very conscious that you don't want to sideline cinema that is coming out of what we call the global south, and you give time and space to those traditions and legacies. What was the most, well, I don't want to use a superlative there. No, I just want to leave that as an open question in terms of what drew you to some of that cinema and how important was that to be in the book?
I mean, if you could have been there for some of our discussions about what to include and what not to include, we probably could do 3 more of these books. There were so many titles, and it just, there are certain countries that I think, as a cinema fan and somebody who writes about the history of cinema, your brain jumps to Italy because there are so many films there, and certainly to countries like France and West Germany. But I think it was important for us to find a balance as best as we could and include as many countries as possible. For me, I really started getting towards the end of when we were finishing the manuscript, realizing that there were all of these films that we probably wanted to include from South America and from the Middle East. But, when you're working with a publisher, you have a word count, and they don't want a book that's twice the length that they agreed to publish. So for me, if I could pick one thing, I'm really happy that we were able to include some of that African anti-colonialism liberation cinema and some of the Middle Eastern cinema, the shorter essay I did on Youssef Chahine, because I think a lot of English language cinema fans don't know about those movies or are only coming to them in more recent years.
Yeah, I think I suppose I went down the Latin American rabbit hole a bit. Because we wanted to sort of give it that sort of broad coverage. As I said, the film could have just been basically about films from Italy, really. Italy and Western Europe, and we didn't want that. We wanted a book that was within the word count, sort of managed to sort of traverse as much of that cinema as possible. So that, you know, and even the sort of South and Latin American sections of the book, I feel, are a bit. I mean, we could have done so much more. So we included George Sandinas from Bolivia. That's Blood of the Condor was one of the essays. That's 1969. I mean, the one that, excuse me, the essay the outtake that I enjoyed writing, enjoying is not actually the right word, but I was fascinated by some of the cinema in Argentina, and Raimundo Glesia. I'm going to pronounce that incorrectly. His 1973 film, The Traitors, which is sort of made just before the dirty war in Argentina. That was a real. I mean, it's a kind of very didactic, complicated film, and the version of it that I was watching was a very dark, grainy, YouTube video of it, because it's not available to my knowledge anywhere else. But fascinating film about Argentina's sort of labour politics, Peronism, and in the lead up to the in the lead up to the dirty war, and of course and of course that's the other thing I think that we touch on in the book, is a theme running through the book. I mean, 1968 is the sort of is in some respects an overblown concept. 1968, the year 1968, but nonetheless, it's a useful historical marker to peg things to and to start discussions from. And one of the things that 1968 does is it sort of helps push this notion within a lot of cinema, particularly in the global South, but also in some aspects of the West, of the director not as the sort of person who is imparting some major insight, but is someone who's much more working in a much more democratic way, trying to sort of, I suppose, channel and depict what's going on in society. And that's something that's very much taken by Latin American new cinema, and they run with that very strongly. And obviously that includes those directors who are working before the dirty war in Argentina, and also George Sandinas and people like that. So that's, I think, something else that's also going through the book as well. That sort of the director having a different relationship both with how they do a picture, with their cast, with the material, and of course different ways of how these people are getting their movies out, how these people are showing their movies. I mean, you mentioned, John, in Italy there's still that tradition of showing a film and then having a discussion. And of course, not only are sort of the Latin American new cinema directors sort of trying to make films which are consciously positioned opposite Hollywood product, but they're also trying to distribute those films in a very different way. They're trying to, their films are very radical, so often they're not shown in sort of mainstream sort of cinema networks, but they're people like George Sandinas, he's taking his film out to sort of like far-flung Indian villages and setting up the projector and then showing the film and then having a discussion afterwards. And also that was something that Glazer also did as well. So it's a different,
is so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did an earlier episode on the Chinese propagandists going out and doing this during the Mao years, and which was a real fascinating extension of that idea of what going to the cinema might be for a non-Western audience. And we mentioned earlier Japan and how I mean I'm interested in this concept as well in your subtitle, in terms of politics of resistance and revolution, that yes, in the West we have this idea of the 1968 and how that is really centered between Paris and Berkeley. You know, it's Paris and the anti-war protesters, and to a lesser extent places strikes happening in Fiat and in Italy and Grosvenor Square in London and things like that. But we tend to see it in those narrow sort of locuses. When you extend that to world cinema, they're hitting different points where it's exploding in different places? Are there moments where nothing is happening and then suddenly it's all happening, and that's happening in a totally different time to the rest of the world? Or was this a global thing in that moment?
I think that if I could just say, I just think that yes and no. I think Sam makes the point Sam made the point now in the introduction to the book. It was one of the points she brought to that introduction, that it is a global movement, and in a sense, we look at this group. We've grouped a whole lot of directors and films together in this book. I'm going to avoid using the dreaded term. We've grouped it together, but they weren't necessarily. They weren't obviously all in communication. They weren't all talking. They're picking up on that political vibe, that political thing that's running through that sort of broad movement. Would you say that's right, Sam?
Yeah, so I think it is a global movement. I think what the focus is very much depends on the region of the world that you're making films in and what the main conflicts there were. Like, you have all of these filmmakers reacting to the expansion of American imperialism. And so they have a different focus than, say, filmmakers who are more in Africa dealing with these wars overthrowing colonialism. And so it's like they're tackling similar themes. Some of them are involved in either overlapping or adjacent political movements. I mean, to briefly get back to Japan, you have somebody like Koji Wakamatsu, who is making these really transgressive, really radical sex films, also funding some of the other new wave directors as a producer, helping to get them money. But then he's also literally going to Palestine and training in training camps and making films about the struggle for Palestinian liberation. And so, like, I do think there is genuine crossover, but lots of overlapping Venn diagrams.
Yeah, they're not sitting in, like, all the Latin American new cinema directors are not sitting in a room going, "Oh, this is out." There is a manifesto. There is a discussion that's going on throughout Latin America about how we make films that are not Hollywood films and how we actually get these films out to, I suppose what they would have said were the most oppressed aspects of Latin American society, to rural peasants, to industrial workers, that these people, we show these films and we have discussions about them, but it's not a movement in the way that we think about it in the concept of 2025, is it? And there's links to that. I mean, there's groups in America, in North America, are showing those Latin American new cinema films, and they're also donating money to help make them. They're basically helping. They're helping with the dynamics of that production, but it's also kind of autonomous, and it's also quite fragmented. I get the feeling in a lot of respects.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the fragmentation has to do with how people viewed the effectiveness of violence. And so I think, in the US, you have different groups kind of arguing with each other about, is terrorism effective and things along those lines. But, you also have, like, I think you mentioned this in your chapter, the people like the Black Panthers watching Battle of Algiers to get, strategy and techniques, because it is kind of a guide on how to overthrow an oppressive government. But to me, I think the real divide is when you look at the filmmakers and their aims, the dividing line, and I'm sure there could be many, but for me, the dividing line is who is occupied and who's not occupied. So like the West German films are very different in the way they deal with urban guerrilla warfare as compared to, the films dealing with Algeria, the films dealing with other parts of Africa, even to some degree the Japanese films, because early on they are occupied in a very different way, but it's still, so I think to me that's kind of what the difference is, like who is actually at war, actually under occupation, and who is just being smothered to death by capitalism.
I always wonder as well about the 1960s, 70s, that sort of revolutionary energy that was there, and how sometimes it went in directions that I certainly felt very uncomfortable with. The famous example of Eldridge Cleaver, you know, talking about rape being a revolutionary act, and you see a scene in Fistful of Dynamite by Sergio Leone, certainly a suggested rape happening right in the first 5 minutes, and you're supposed to feel, well, the woman's rich, so she somehow, it's a revolutionary act. She's going to be brought down by the working class bandit, and so as a viewer, I'm kind of feel uncomfortably like I'm participating in this, or I'm supposed to be. How do those are those contradictions things which are being debated? I'm presuming yes. So I guess the question is, how are they being debated, and what is the level? I mean, I noticed that I've read the long piece on Valia Solanas, the author of the Scum Manifesto, for instance, which I kind of think is a wonderful, her piece about men having to have the speech where they admit to being turds and so on. It's just like I don't think she's got a wicked sense of humor, as well as, I don't want to trivialize it, but as well as her other claims to fame.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons we want to include some exploitation cinema in here as well, because I think when you're a filmmaker who's not operating in mainstream cinema and maybe not even trying to, you can explore some of this more transgressive side of things. So I don't know if I think any of these directors are intentionally trying to come out and say that those more maybe abhorrent elements are good or bad. It just, there's a lot of provocation in there.
Mm. Right, yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely, no, absolutely. It seems,
And also a lot of sexism.
Oh yeah, yeah. There's
a huge amount of sexism in
there's a wild amount of sexism, and the thing that I think is important for people to realize in actual political movements and also in the films that we cover is that people can have radical politics, but that doesn't mean that they automatically have them across the board in all areas of their lives. And
Right.
a lot of the films that show up in the book deal with how sexism and classism are kind of factor into these different radical movements, and how, and I don't think we talk about this explicitly, but you can definitely see some of these more like armchair leftist European art house films where it's like a person coming from privilege is making a film about the revolution. And it's like, okay, Jean-Luc Godard, I love you, but like, have you ever actually worked a day in your life? Like, no, you have not. You can see him grappling with this as his films progress.
those Cahiers articles don't write themselves, you know.
True. It's very true, especially not when you have Rivette breathing down your neck. But I do think it's such a fascinating part of looking at this specific time period is to see how some of those filmmakers deal with things like those issues of sexism, which are, of course, all over the Japanese films, the Italian films, the German films really deal with it because I think it was most obvious there. It's like the more you have these radical groups like the various Red Army factions who are trying to live together in these communes and trying to start a new way of life, it's like, okay, but you're still bringing all of your baggage with you.
Yeah, and in terms of sexuality as well, there's I mean, even as late as the 70s, you were having sort of very leftist parties talking about homosexuality being the ultimate decadence of the bourgeoisie, and it's just
Which is crazy.
Yeah, exactly. But it is it is that thing of looking at a movement which is disjointed and is a bit all over the place, and you combine that with, like, look, we want to get our films made, and we want to use maybe a Roger Corman form of funding to get them made, then we are going to toe the line between exploitation. We are going to be diving into exploitation and having to do that. Or even, as Andrew is mentioning, I mean, the example I use, Sergio Leone, it's not an isolated incident in his filmography. He is,
Once Upon a Time in America, hello. I mean, it's
precisely
that one in particular, rife with that, that sort of stuff. That's a film that I find sort of an incredibly hard watch as a diversion. Yes, a couple of years ago, Melbourne Cinematheque showed the extended cut of Once Upon a Time in America as its opening film for the year season. And I must admit, there were one or two. I mean, I hadn't seen it for about 15 years, but there were one or two, aspects of that film that were incredibly hard watches.
Yeah.
Including a gratuitously extended rape sequence, and just the whole sexual politics of that film are hard going.
Which is much longer in the extended version, I'm not sure.
So much longer.
And I'm not even sure if it's better or worse, in the sense that it's more grueling.
What's the point? What's the point?
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a digression, I know, but
I feel like I'm probably going to be struck by lightning saying this out loud, but sometimes I feel like it's necessary to have films with these sorts of political aspects that are not trying to be this sort of set treatise on what your politics should be and how you should enact them in the world. They're also entertainment. And like we keep saying, some of them are exploitation films. And I think it is important to have a wide range of types of films, because otherwise, and to go back to Godard, I think this is a big problem for a lot of people when they first start consciously seeking out political cinema and what does that mean and what does it look like. It's, you don't want somebody yelling their politics at you in a way that's not entertaining and that is maybe just like not what you want out of a film. So while a lot of these do, especially the more genre films like the Polizioteschi and the spaghetti westerns, while they do have exploitation film elements, I think those serve a purpose too, because I don't know, I think especially with rape in cinema, it should be unpleasant. And cutting it out, which I think there have been discussions in recent decades of how do we deal with sexism on film sets? How do we deal with it in the films themselves? And it seems like a lot of people try to argue, like, let's just not show it at all. But that to me is worse. It's almost like you're pretending that it doesn't exist.
Yeah, in the context of that example, though, Once Upon a Time in America, I mean, I get that's doing something. I mean, we are jumping. That's doing something that The Godfather isn't, which is showing just how vile, venal, sexist, and terrible these gangsters are in private life as well as public. There's no, there's not the Godfather distinction there, but but of the sort of. But do you need to do that for 5 minutes?
I mean, he thought so.
Which is actually one of those. I think pretty much how long that one of the rape sequences anyway goes in Once Upon a Time in America.
No, I was just going to say, I do think when it comes to looking at political violence or maybe violence that's able to be politicized in some of these organized crime films, it is really interesting to see how the more mainstream films that often win a billion awards really glorify these organized crime families and basically treat them as a substitute for existing power structures like businesses and governments. And so to see the directors who show some of those people as just being criminals, and you get this in a lot of Japanese Yakuza films as well, in some really interesting ways, Hong Kong triad films also. I do think it's valuable. Maybe you don't need a super long, super graphic, extended rape sequence to show that, but a lot of these films have it as a way of showing like these people are actually kind of terrible, but why are they terrible? How did they get to be that way? What effect is that having? Does
Yeah,
that
yeah,
lessen
yeah.
their politics? You know.
I do think that it's almost like it's turning around the idealization, the putting on the pedestal, and the sort of romanticism of the character, and that the character has towards his sort of romantic love, and he builds up this whole myth about her, which his use of violence then is although it's only although it is 5 minutes and that's a long time. I mean, we're getting into Gaspar Noé territory of this is an ordeal for the audience. But yeah, no, I'm wavering. I'm wavering more towards
Yeah,
Sam at the
not
moment.
not that I'm necessarily trying to come out and convince everyone that like this 5 minute rape scene needs to be in there, but I do think those scenes of really transgressive sexual violence have an important impact, and they
Sure.
are all
Absolutely.
throughout the films in that we cover in the book.
I
Yeah.
mean, those
Yeah.
Patty Hearst films, and
Well,
and the actual experience that Patty Hearst had,
And the Koji
is a really good
Wakamatsu
example of that.
films.
And the what, say?
And the Koji Wakamatsu films too. I mean, at least, I don't know, 80% of them deal with rape or sexual coercion and how that
Yeah.
is connected to radical politics. And he was an avowed, very passionate leftist, probably for more decades than almost any other director in the book. So it's not like he was trying to use it as a sort of negative propaganda, but I don't know, part exploitation film, part pink film requirements in the Japanese film industry, lots of reasons.
I'm interested as well in the sort of the these gray zones around these movies that they're transgressive in terms of sex and violence, and they're also transgressive in terms of they're not situated neatly for people to even review or talk about or discuss sort of in an art house way. Something that I think that's great about your book is you're putting Goddard next to the rape gang or the rape squad, and you're putting Pontecorvo next to a horror film from the Philippines, and it that just putting that material together allows the reader to sort of, first of all, build up a really interesting watch list on Letterboxd, but also to sort of see those ideas coming from loads of different angles, from loads of different people, different cultures, and that's what makes it, I think, such a fascinating book.
Thank you. That's a huge compliment. And I think is what we were going for.
Yeah, but as we've discussed, Sam, it was something that actually we only realised came together right at the very end, because it was such a disparate, geographically, politically, in terms of film styles, in terms of directorial styles. It's a very broad, disparate body of cinema, and it was actually only when Sam and I were editing the final manuscript and we'd pretty much, finished all the articles, that a sort of coherence, in a sense, came into being. That coherence between 1960, the Algerian the war of liberation in Algeria, and basically the collapse of communism in the early 90s, and not so much a coherence in the films, but you can see connections and links and similar themes and similar concerns that are sort of shot through all that cinema. That when you're just looking at individual articles, individual directors, you don't sort of see all those, you don't see all those connections.
Yeah, we really agonized over the table of contents, and I think it paid off in a huge way because it does have a sort of logic where it starts, and we probably should have said 1955 to 1990 because we do talk about some 50s cinema, but it's like it starts with Battle of Algiers in Algeria in the mid 50s and then kind of goes naturally from there in a way that I think does make sense and connects seemingly very different films to each other.
One of the other things I was thinking, which is a personal response here, I was thinking of the film How to Blow Up a Pipeline by Daniel Goldhaber, I think it's called. And it was one of the first films for ages that I was watching and I was thinking, oh, okay, I know how this goes. It's based on a non-fiction environmentalist sort of manifesto by, I think, a Dutch author. And he makes it into a fictional sort of heisty sort of movie, which is about a group of disparate people going on a mission to blow up a pipeline and essentially using terrorism for environmental ends. And we're seeing Extinction Rebellion using non-violent but similar, but at least engaging in much more disruptive behavior than has recently been seen. And the film is interesting because, and this is, if anybody wants to see it and hasn't seen it already, this is a mild spoiler, where a Hollywood movie would basically at some point say the message has to be that using explosives in any context will have unforeseen circumstances and you shouldn't do it. That's responsible filmmaking. That's the responsible message. And the film doesn't do that. And it's kind of like, that's a real sort of surprise that you just go, okay. Yeah, and it feels like a film from the 60s. Now, the reason I connected that while I was reading your book is that Goldhaber's now making Faces of Death, which is also in your book. He's doing a remake of it. And given how this young director's career is progressing, it just makes me think, okay, there are some people out there who are looking back to this extreme cinema or this, this exploitation cinema and do have political ideas and are sort of somehow trying to negotiate them, somehow trying to put them together.
Yeah, which I think, best of luck to him. But my understanding is that he's maybe running into some difficulties with that Faces of Death remake. And I think you kind of, with that word negotiating, you really sort of hit on the main issue here is that if you're making films in the United States and you want either Hollywood money or distribution, you have so many hoops that you have to jump through. And I think often what they seem to try to do, either consciously or not, is to take a mildly interesting new filmmaker and then to try to sign them up to do a Marvel movie or something where like they don't even have creative control, but they have this entire unit of other directors like filming the action scenes and handling the digital effects sequences. And I know that that happens with horror movies as well as these bigger budget action films. And I think it's just a way of taking control of someone's career and making sure that they don't do things that are interesting, which I think is why you see so few examples of that here in the US. It's really frustrating.
I know that about the Marvel films. I did not know that about the horror movies. That's a really interesting point.
Yeah, I don't have too much optimistic to say, sadly, about about how people can maybe keep making films like this now. Like, I don't even know where you would go.
Yeah, I mean, Chloe Zhao going and doing the Eternals. I remember making that point once on social media and somebody saying, oh no, she pitched it. She wanted to make it. And I perfectly willing to accept that she did. But that in itself kind of makes me feel even worse. That sort of like you're making these great movies, and then you get to a certain point, and you think now's the time for my take on superheroes.
Yeah, I hate this phrase, but it's selling out.
Yeah, yeah.
But isn't it also about a lot of cinema now? The action and the action and the plot in the film, and this goes back to in some respects our discussion about sexual violence. Some of these exploitation films. I mean, now a film that has sexual violence in it is seen as propagating and supporting sexual violence.
Yes.
Whereas Claude Chabrol can make the Nada Gang about, French left-wing terrorists who kidnapped the US ambassador, and that's not seen necessarily. And I don't think in Chabrol's hands, based on a Manchette crime novel, it's not a call to kidnap a US ambassador, because the gang are a bumbling bunch of sort of left-wing radicals. But he's not getting blowback for just making a film about political violence, and that's really terrible and all that. It's in the ether, and it's accepted that this is part of political discussion and political discourse, that you can sort of air these ideas. Whereas I don't think you sort of get that leeway now. You make a film, and if the film has troubling, controversial, highly political, and highly political in many ways, content, it's seen as encouraging that, and then it just becomes site for criticism and a culture war and call out culture and all that sort of thing. You see that very strongly.
No, I think this all depends on who you're talking to, which film's about, because
Sure. But on a mainstream sense, I'm talking,
But even like having been to screenings with maybe more like younger, more mainstream audiences watching 70s and 80s films, they're like, why isn't this canceled? Like, why is there rape in this film? Why is there this element? So I think it's really pervasive. Like in general, being in New York is incredible because audiences here are more receptive and will go out and see things that they have no idea what it is. It's just, it's showing at an art house theater, so let's go check it out. But I've overheard some really cringy conversations like, why did this character have to be naked? And why was there a 10-minute sex scene? And it's like, what?
That character was really right-wing. Why was that character so right-wing? That was really offensive.
I mean, I think if you find right-wing things offensive, it's hard to live here.
But do you know what I mean? I mean,
yes.
What was that 3 billboards outside Ebbing, Missouri? That's not a good example, but that's
an
interesting example about a film that may think it's a good or a bad film, but it's a film that tries to depict what's a political churn that's going on in the US. And I mean, it gets a lot of criticism for just even presenting that sort of right-wing that right-wing political perspective kind of exists, kind of an inescapable conclusion now, but maybe not so much. I don't know.
I think the idea is that it's played by Sam Rockwell, and we want and it's almost an automatic thing of viewers saying, "Oh, I want to like Sam Rockwell," and you're not allowing me to, and I'm going to throw my toys out of the pram for that reason.
He's an actor. He's acting.
Yeah, precisely.
Sure, but it does remind me of some of those like 70s and 80s films where directors in Europe started to cast conventionally attractive actors as sympathetic Nazis and fascists, and people were like, whoa, like, don't make me think that this man is attractive.
Yeah, Malcolm McDowell is right over there. You can use him. We don't want Alain Delon, who actually is a fascist. We don't actually want
okay.
That's too much. No, I mean this is a degree. I don't know. I don't want to be a grumpy old man and say there's a degree of sophistication lacking in the audience now, but it does it does make me think that we're losing that. There was a thing on just today. I was reading on social media somebody complaining about Blade Runner and saying the love scene in Blade Runner is really problematic. It's really, and other people were saying, I skip it, I skip it, I just skip it, I can't watch it. And I was just thinking, wait a minute, is it even a love scene? I mean, it's first of all, it's a homage to 50s noir, so that sort of like you need a kiss sort of aggressive macho stuff is totally in keeping. Secondly, aren't they both robots? And thirdly, are you supposed to approve of it? You know, is that something the film is even asking you to do? Just feels it feels like just, wow.
It's exhausting.
Yeah, exactly that. He just shot and apparently shot a woman in the back, and you're okay with that?
I mean, as long as there isn't any sexual content to make you uncomfortable, yeah, sure, shoot people. Although,
And that's something Sam and I have talked about, the way that, political violence. I mean, people would find, audiences today potentially would find some of the films that we cover in this book offensive. But I mean, some of these Marvel films, they're so gratuitously violent. And they're
but so incredibly asexual.
so gratuitously violent, and it's largely consequence-free violence that
Yeah.
never has
Well,
any kind of impact in the. I mean, Tony Stark gets upset because they blow up a city at one point or something like that while they're fighting, some bad guy or something like that. But I mean, this is again to cycle back to Pontecorvo. One of the things I found really impressive watching Pontecorvo's 4 films about, Capo, Burn, Battle of Algiers, and Operation Ogro, back to back, is that not only is he having a particularly sophisticated discussion about political violence, he never ever fetishizes political. He takes a political position. Like, I mean, it's very clear that Pontecorvo and Salinas, his screenwriter, Franco Salinas, his screenwriter on the Battle of Algiers, are very firmly pro-FLN. But they don't fetishize the violence, and they show the impact of the violence, whether it's on French settlers or shooting a local cop, or a bunch of French settlers going and blowing up an Arab apartment building. It doesn't matter what colour the skin is the violence, and he sort of shows that, and he doesn't fetishize it, and he's discussing, this is complex. What do you think? Is this the right thing to do? Is it not the right thing to do? And he's trying to bring the audience into a discussion in all those films.
The scene in that film that always makes me burst into tears, which is just me being a dumb, sentimental old geezer, is when after the series of bombs has gone off, and there's a crowd who are about to lynch a young Arab boy, and the policeman steps in and saves him. And it's just like that policeman is kind of, from a political point of view, is the enemy, but he's doing the right thing. And it's not focused on, it's not a big deal in the film. The film doesn't sort of stop and ring a bell and show you that that's happening, but it just breaks my heart when I see that happen, because it's just like, there's human decency here, and it doesn't exist on any one side, and the whole situation. I mean, that's what politics is condemning the situation, which forces people to act in an inhumane way, even when they have all the humanity in the world in their hearts. Not to get to John Lennon about this. Although, John Lennon, another fascinating political figure of the time. Listen, we could talk. There are so many films I wanted to talk about. You mentioned Come and See in this book that we haven't talked about, and that's really interesting from the point of view of making films about political violence in Russia during the Soviet Union. There was a few Polish films that loads, but you have to do a second volume so that you can come back and talk about them. Before I let you go, though, could I please have your recommended books? Sam Deegan, do you want to go first?
Yes. So for me, I think a book that's been really influential on me as a film writer is Thomas Elsasser's Fassbinder's Germany: History, Identity, Subject. And that's something that, made me want to write film books. It's from the mid 90s. He's one of the greatest, more contemporary film academics. And there are a lot of really terrible books about Fassbinder that are where the author is just like scandalized by his sexuality, scandalized by his drug use and his personality and some of his more toxic relationships. But I think this is a book that balances the kind of myth around him, but also gives you such a good sense of the history and politics and the ways that Fassbinder is using them in his films very consciously as a leftist director. So Fassbinder's Germany, highly, highly recommended.
Brilliant. That's going on the to read list straight away.
It's
Thank you.
so good. Throw out all the other Fassbinder books.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sam. Andrew?
Yeah, one book I read this year that I really enjoyed was a book by Nicholas G. Schlegel, and it's called German Popular Cinema and the Rialto Crimi Phenomenon. And it's basically a book about a body of film of sort of crime films made in post-war Germany that were riffing off the novels of British writer called Edgar Wallace. And they're fascinating. I mean, I know, Sam, you're a big Crimi fan as well, but
I'm pretty sure he quotes me in his book.
Yes, I think he does. He does. And I mean, they're essentially very German crime stories, but all sort of set in a sort of faux London in post-war, in the post-war period, and they're absolutely fascinating films from a sort of aesthetic point of view, but also sort of the themes that they're interrogating in German society, etc., after World War II, and the things that can be said and not said. And I just thought it was was keen to get this book for ages, but it was a hardcover academic book, and then it came out in soft cover, and a German friend got it for me, and it's basically got a rundown of every single one of the Rialto Crimi films. Yeah, it's a fascinating book.
Brilliant. Okay,
We need more box sets of them. They've been hard to find,
and they're really hard to see. They're really hard to find. Yeah, absolutely.
that sounds great. That sounds like you've given me a couple of great book recommendations, and now I've got a full letterboxed to watch list following reading your wonderful book, Revolution in 35 millimeters, edited by Andrew Nett and Sam Deegan. Political Violence and Resistance in Cinema from the Arthouse to the Grindhouse. And I'll put a link up on the show notes so that you can get a copy if you haven't already. Thank you so much, Sam. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure.